Welcome, everybody. Thanks for hanging in all day for this first day of the Charleston conference. Before we get started, I'm just going to hand over to our volunteer, Keandra. She's got a bit of information for you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am here volunteering to let you all know. 1, if you have questions, I will bring the microphone around. 2, we encourage spirited discussion and debate, but we also need you to adhere to the Charleston Conference Code of Conduct with everything that you do here. That's it from me.
Am I the only one that didn't realize that there was a code of conduct? So that's your homework for tonight, to go take a look at that. So welcome to our session, Developing Success Criteria, Transformative Agreements for Both Read and Publish Institutions. Joining me, I'm Heather Staines. I'm a senior strategy consultant for Delta Think. I always forget that. And joining me today are Michael Levine Clark from the University of Denver and John McDonald from EBSCO. We have a jam-packed data session for you today, so we will get started right away. I'm going to kick off a little bit. So one of the exercises that Delta Think does every year is we go through a publisher survey, and we talk to publishers about their actual publication output as well as any corresponding revenue around OA. And then we release it in a free news and views that publishes in October. This year published October 18th and was followed up in a webinar on October 25th. So all of that is online if you want to go and take a look. But I thought I would just pull out some of the highlights, some of the headlines for you today. As I mentioned, we do that exercise every year, and we keep everything aggregated. We don't share any specific revenue from publishers, but we think it's important to know what the state of the market is. Our current estimate, we really think that the OA market has accelerated way ahead of what we had predicted back in 2021, and the estimate is $1.6 billion. And we do think that it's going to cross the $2 billion mark in 2024 if current trends continue. And that's even with falling back to trend after those big COVID boosts with the huge numbers of articles being submitted. So that is a very large increase over 2020, 32% increase by our numbers, and that at the moment, around 45% of all scholarly articles that were published as paid for OA, so it doesn't include green, it includes gold and hybrid, accounts for just under 15% of the total journal publishing market value. So there's still a gap between the percentage of content and the percentage of revenue, but we do expect that to start to shift as more of the revenue that comes from different types of transformative agreements is allocated a little bit differently within the publishers themselves. Some of these things I've mentioned already. COVID led, as many of you know, to a huge increase in publishing activity. It showed above average volume in both 2020 and in the entirety of 2021. Publishers have been increasingly focused on OA in the wake of Plan S, and the recent OSTP policy announcement is likely to accelerate OA even faster. The output we saw in hybrid journals continues to be boosted more than other OA output. So we're keeping an eye on that growth there. Prices overall, generally in APCs, we have seen an increase. There were exchange rate fluctuations, as many of you know, particularly if you traveled from outside the U.S., and the strong dollar, and that did compound that exceptional growth in publishing activity, including the increasing reported revenues on those trends. And because OA is increasingly delivered as part of these mixed model transitional and deals, we do think that, as I mentioned, the publishers are going to reallocate their OA. So just their revenue. So just a couple of charts to show you. This comes from our Delta Think analysis. So on the left-hand side, the gray is subscription revenue, subscription articles, and then the sort of brick-colored is the all OA. So you can see that how we are in the last full year of data is 2021, which is roughly the center there. So we do anticipate that shortly those lines will cross. So we're keeping an eye on that. On the right-hand side is the graph that shows the different types of OA, gold being shown in gold and hybrid being shown in blue. So you can see how those are proceeding apace. And just to kind of set the stage for some of the data that John and Michael are going to be providing, I wanted to show you a sort of snapshot over time. These are 4 publishers. We're not going to identify them. Publisher A, Publisher B, Publisher C, and Publisher D. Real creative in the naming process there. But you can see that across the different portfolios, the growth of OA can differ dramatically over time, with some publishers like Publisher C really almost showing a kind of a static level for their gold, but a significant growth to hybrid. And you can see with those blue bars for the final year for each, I referenced how the hybrid article growth was really outpacing the gold article growth. So with that sort of stage setting about what's kind of going on in the entirety of the market, I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Great, thanks, Heather. So, in a sense have a bunch of different pieces of a study that we're trying to sort of cram together to get a better understanding of transformative agreements. And we started looking at a broader question: how do you measure the value of a big deal? At Charleston in 2020, we sort of went through a few other presentations at ER&L, again at Charleston, at UKSG, and at NASIG. And this is building on those, but there's more information in those, right? That we're not going to give those same presentations again. We are going to repeat parts of them. But we think it's important to try to understand what the value of the big deal is as we're thinking about what the value of bigger big deals, transformative agreements, might be. The question today is really how do you measure the value of a transformative agreement? As we're starting to move into transformative agreements, how do you think about those? How do you think about whether they're successful or not? Just to define transformative agreements, on a pretty fundamental level, they are designed to help us transition from paying for reading to paying for publishing, right? We want to transform it so that the costs are allocated for publishing rather than for reading. They may be the thing that's going to get us to an open future. They may just be bigger, big deals. They might actually be both. They are, I think commonly there's the read and publish model where there's some subscription fees that are essentially used to cover the cost of publishing. And there are different ways that these work, and we're not really going to get into the nuts and bolts of how the different models work. This is sort of a broader overview of how to think about the value. Some things to think about as you're starting to think through whether to enter a transformative agreement and which publishers to negotiate with. We need to have a better understanding at the institutional level of what's going on with our publishing. Libraries, I don't think, have much of a sense of what's happening with APCs at our institutions. It's really hard to get that data. It's coming from many different sources. Sometimes it's coming from a department. Sometimes it's coming from the Office of Research. Sometimes it's coming from a college. Sometimes it's coming from somebody's research fund. So we don't really have a good understanding of that money from an institutional perspective. We don't always even know where our authors are publishing. We can get some of that information, but it's actually hard to gather that information across the board. We do not know who the corresponding author is, and there's more on that in a minute, but it's really hard actually to identify corresponding author in the aggregate. And if you don't know corresponding author, you don't actually know what the costs for your institution are of of publishing, because corresponding authors are the ones who are responsible for paying APCs. Publishers don't always record corresponding author in a reportable way. They know it, but it's not easily communicated. And so there's a challenge in gathering that data. Before beginning a transformative agreement, you need to understand those patterns, though, right? Which are the publishers that my authors are publishing in, which journals, which subjects. Subject can impact the cost of the APCs and certainly can impact where you should be negotiating. And then trying to figure out who pays the APCs on any given campus is challenging as well, right? So that's just groundwork that I think we need to do ahead of time, and we often ask the publisher for that information, but we should be trying to understand some of that at our institutions as well. So I want to start out by looking at two institutions and trying to sort of give you a sense of some of what we've just pulled together on these two institutions just from common data that anybody can gather, right? This is generally data from Dimensions and then some data from Web of Science as well. So Institution J is a doctoral high research activity institution. It's an R2. It's a private institution that doesn't have a medical school, and they publish about 1,000 articles annually. Institution A is very large. It's the largest institution in our data set, a large R1 with a medical school that publishes 13,000 articles a year. These are very different institutions, but they're both research institutions. And I think as we're thinking through how to negotiate these, we need to understand different types of institutions. One question is just, are there differences in publication patterns at these two different institutions? And the blue is Institution A, the orange color is Institution J. And these are just a set of 10 publishers and how different the publication patterns are at these two institutions. Taylor and Francis is huge at Institution J. It's actually their second highest publisher, but is fifth for the other institution, and so on, right? There's a lot of variation between these two institutions, and it would make a lot of sense for Institution J to be thinking about a transformative agreement with Taylor and Francis. It might make less sense for Institution A. Publication patterns do change year over year, but they roughly cluster together. These are a bunch of different publishers, and you can see that for the most part, they kind of where they stack up in terms of ranking at this is just the one institution, Institution J, that they're roughly the same year to year. There's a little bit of fluctuation, but not a huge amount. It would be interesting to think, though, through whether some of the publishers at the bottom are good or bad candidates, considering that there's not a huge amount of publishing going on overall. There are some big disciplinary differences. I don't expect you to be able to see this, but these are the same list of subject areas, and you can see that the bars are very different size. Institution J, the largest publication area, is psychology and cognitive sciences. Institution A, it's medical and health sciences. And that matters because there are different publishing patterns in those disciplines. There are different funding sources. There are different journals. There are probably different APC costs. There are different publishers. Here's some differences in OA publishing at these two institutions. Institution J, again, this is the smaller R2 that has a social science and psychology focus and about 1,000 articles annually. They're more closed than open, right? They're publishing more articles behind a paywall than open access articles. Institution A has more open access publishing than closed publishing, and they're the one that has the medical school and the health sciences focus. If you start to dig into the type of OA publishing, this is all publishers at these two institutions, and you can see that the top line is green open access, the next line down is bronze, then gold, then hybrid. Gold and hybrid are increasing at both institutions, and in fact, gold has surpassed all other types of open access publishing at both of these institutions. Institution A is publishing a lot more gold or hybrid combined than Institution J, right? 36% versus 21%. Green and bronze are interesting, but they're actually irrelevant when we're thinking about transformative agreements, right? They're not impacted by the transformative agreement. They matter, but they don't matter in terms of how to think about the value of a transformative agreement. So here's just a look at hybrid and gold versus closed and green, right? So we've added the green to the closed because, in a sense, that's not manageable by the transformative agreement. You can see that at both of these institutions, the articles that are closed on the publisher website, so green plus closed, accounts for the majority of publishing. And the volume of that category is actually increasing at both institutions, right? So subscription titles that are not open on the publisher website, are going up at both of these institutions. But the open content that's on the publisher site, the hybrid plus gold, is also increasing, right? So there's an increase overall, and maybe those lines meet at some point. So that takes us from some data that's any of you can gather from dimensions, right? That was just a lot of work pulling data out and then sort of massaging the data, but it's readily available in dimensions. And we then built a data set of 20 institutions to try to learn, I think, a little bit more about different publishing patterns at different institutions. So questions that we're asking in this large data set, what proportion of articles with one or more authors are corresponding author articles, right? I talked already about the fact that it's really hard to identify corresponding author. We spent some time trying to figure out if there was any sort of formula that you could use to sort of predict corresponding author rate. We looked at the value of the APCs that would be covered by the agreements. If you were to if these institutions were to enter a transformative agreement based on current publishing patterns, what would the value of those APCs be, right? If they were sort of converting to APC. We looked at how much each institution paid for their big deal versus what the potential corresponding author APC cost would be, right? So we actually asked each of these institutions. They gave us data about their big deals, including the big deal costs, and then we compared that to sort of what the cost of publishing would be. In this combined data set, we ended up removing 3 publishers, and they're Wiley, OUP, and Taylor and Francis. And we've actually been talking to those 3 publishers about sort of why their corresponding author data might be lower in dimensions than these other publishers. It's not that there's any flaw in their data. It's just the way that it sort of gets communicated to dimensions and reported in dimensions. But anyway, we removed those 3 publishers from the data set because we didn't have full corresponding author data. We did some work to try to clean up the corresponding author field. So on single authored articles, we made the assumption that single author was the corresponding author, because of course they would have to be. When there was a multi-authored article and all of the articles were from the same institution, we assigned that institution as the corresponding author. And then we did some proportional splitting on the other multi-authored articles. We enhanced this data set by adding ISSNs, and we added APC pricing as well. And this whole data set is 7 publishers, 20 institutions. 8 of those institutions are R1s, again, the largest research institutions. And then the remaining 12 range from some R2s down to really small baccalaureate granting institutions. Across this data set, there are 5,800 journals and over 100,000 articles. We spent some time thinking about APC cost, right? There's what an APC maybe should cost. There's what they actually cost, and that ranges pretty much from up from about $889 for some up to $3,000 and more. And we spent some time thinking about that, and really it's about what people are willing to pay. We compared the APC cost by institution, right? So these are the 20 institutions that we have data for. A is the largest institution. T is the smallest institution. This is the average cost of gold APCs for each institution is the gold bar, and the sort of the brownish bar is the hybrid APC average. The average cost of a hybrid APC across these institutions is $3,000, and the average cost of a gold is about $2,100. Here's the average APCs paid by publisher, right? So across this data set, we've got these 7 publishers. We started with 10. We threw out 3 because we didn't have full corresponding author data. And you can see that there's actually quite a range. In all cases, the hybrid APC is more expensive than the gold. One of these publishers, APA, doesn't do hybrid journals, right? That's why there's only 1 bar for them. Here's a publisher, and this is looking at big deal spending versus what we think the corresponding author APCs should be. Sort of based on what we know about their publishing patterns and what we know about what they actually spend on a big deal for this publisher. And the big deal cost is the blue line, and the potential spend to publish their articles with this publisher is the black line. You can see that in some places it's very comparable. It's about the same. In many cases, as you get to the smaller institutions, the potential APC spend is actually less than the big deal spend. Here's a different publisher, same concept, roughly the same pattern, but it's interesting that if you look at that, the sort of the long tail of small institutions, it matches pretty closely what they're paying for subscriptions versus what they would be paying for APCs. So this is sort of one piece of a study, right? And again, we're trying to sort of pick at this question in a number of different ways. So some of what we learned in this first part of the study is that the data standards vary across different providers, right? So there were variations in journal title, there were variations in open access definitions, right? So how open access is defined by whichever database we're using. There are some issues with ISSNs, with publisher names. 7% of our sample actually lacked an ISSN entirely. There are problems with article type, like how do you define a research article, which is what we're really thinking about, versus other types of article. And there's not a standard way of doing it. It would be really nice if there were. There's some clearly a lack of standardization and a lack of information about corresponding author, right? There's a lot of missing information there. It's hard to understand who the corresponding author and therefore what the corresponding author institution is for a lot of the multi-authored articles. This is something that I think needs some work. There's also sort of some patterns that we looked at but didn't really document, but they were sort of observable as we looked through it, that, for instance, there seemed to be more book reviews at some of the smaller institutions. And so there could be some variations in what's being published that impact how to think about this. And so I'm going to now turn it over to John, who's going to take us through some new data that sort of tries to answer some more detailed questions about a subset of these 20 institutions.
Okay, thank you, Michael. As part of our research, we want to really analyze, are you really transforming your agreement, and what types of institutions are benefiting the most from it? So like Michael said, some of our institutions, huge land grant, ARLs, publish a lot. You know, it would make sense that, you know, their thousands of authors are going to benefit from having a transformative agreement. But that's not the majority of libraries that are out there. Most of our libraries, institutions, you know, small liberal arts publish a lot less. Are they still getting value maybe on the read side? So we wanted to look at wanted to analyze. We've got, from this data set of 20 institutions, we have 5 where we have enough data from their counter reports and information about their corresponding authorship, and then the value of their formerly big deals, and possibly new transformative agreements. So we're going to look at a few of those aspects. So we have our 5 institutions. One of them is an R2, 2 R3s, 2 masters. None of them had a read and publish deal until 2021, so a lot of this is analyzing in a predictive fashion, based on what they used to do, what are they going to do in the future. Our research colleague, Jason Price, who has presented on a number of these, he works for Skelk, and they have a transformative agreement. So one of our former presentations, he went in depth into those institutions, but we're taking a step back and looking at institutions that are not necessarily in that consortia. So we have 4 of our major publishers, and our presentations, we often will give a caveat. We're not trying to say this publisher has a good deal, this publisher has a bad deal. We're not trying to make value judgments along those lines, and that's why we obscure some of the publishers other than like publicly available data. But again, we have the type of publishing model, open access model they would have published in, closed, like Michael said, closed, bronze, and green are sort of non-author specific types of publishing, or publisher, the publisher's not doing anything for any of those types of publishing, but then a hybrid in gold as another category. So again, just take our presentation with a grain of salt. We're looking at this data in sort of a directional purposes to really understand how, as we go along, like I said, a lot of transformative agreements just started in 2021. So we're going to want to gather data over the course of years and really understand how this is working. So we do have a kind of an outline. Skelk, when they went and built a transformative agreement, they had these values-based frameworks that they were interested in. And I just put up some of the salient points. Many of the values are qualitative. So is the transformative agreement simple for authors to access and easy for libraries to administer? So that's going to be a yes, no, maybe it's getting better or it's getting worse, whatever it is. But for our purposes, we wanted to look at the quantitative aspects of the transformative agreement. So they want to demonstrate a path to open access over time. So we can actually look at the data and see, are we publishing more open access in the right models over time? Redistribute costs fairly and sustainably. So are you getting good value out of the APCs that you would have paid versus the transformative agreement? Are you still getting a lot of read value in your usage of those journals, and how's that changing over time? Have total cost be in a controlled fashion. And then another one which I love is supporting OA publishing for authors without grant funding. So a lot of our smaller institutions, a lot of disciplines aren't overwhelmed with a lot of grant funding. So how can we actually promote that through a transformative agreement and get them some publishing support? So a few, a few slides. So these are our 5 institutions and all 4 publishers over time. And you can see the OA gold is actually increasing over time. So for this smaller data set, just like Michael pointed out for the bigger data set, it's growing over time. It's coming at a little bit of cost to green. So if we turn a transformative agreement, or if we turn a package deal into a transformative agreement, now the authors don't have to bother depositing their manuscripts in the IR, so they're going to publish it gold on the publisher website, obviously. But the growth of total publications is still going up. So our publishers are publishing more OA, but a lot more total content as well, which might not be really helping us on helping us as librarians, trying to convert the model to full OA. So this chart shows, I just selected out the gold and the hybrid. So the gold bars. It does fluctuate over time, but they are, overall, the trend is going up. But hybrid's actually increasing, at least for this smaller subset, increasing a lot faster as well, which doesn't necessarily help us, flip the entire journal into, a full gold OA. And by publisher, and again, we're going to point out Cambridge because Jason had the data set for Cambridge, and you can see they're the outlier. So as a university press publisher, their goal is not to publish more. So the increase in gold publishing in our data set with Cambridge is increasing at the expense of the paywall articles. But the other 3 publishers are just growing over time as well. Now, looking at these publishers as well, and I picked different codes than Heather had on hers, but V, X, Y, Z publishers. You can see for our data set, the fluctuation in publishing gold, open access, gold, and hybrid over time by these institutions does vary. So 2017, Publisher Y, our institutions published 24 open access articles with Publisher Y. Then they dropped way down to, I think, 11, and then back up to 24. So it can fluctuate over time. So you might want to think about evaluating your transformative agreements not as a snapshot in time, but as a continuum to see if it's changing. I will say one of our publishers, we did not have data for 2017 for them, so they're actually just a slight outlier on this chart. So dollars-wise, if our institutions published and paid APCs for every one of these articles that they published open access, this is what it would come out to over time. So generally, like I said, it fluctuates a little bit. It is growing. If you look at just comparing 2021 to 2017, obviously it's almost doubled in the amount of OA publishing they're doing. And they would have paid, collectively, they would have paid a little over $600,000 in APCs. Now, that's really great that they've got a bunch of articles out there that are open access that nobody else has to pay for, and they would have paid $600,000. So this is just a modeling exercise. They would have paid $600,000. Well, here's what they actually paid these publishers for their big deals, over $27 million. So just a small portion of it would have been paid in APCs. So these institutions are paying a lot for read. If all of these publishers had transformative agreements in place, they're paying a heavy fee for the read portion as well. We have coined a new metric called cost per controlled use. So in the past, you would have evaluated your package deals by looking at cost per use, let's say. Well, your users are using a lot of gold OA content in these packages through hybrid journals and through full gold OA. So we take out the usage of open access content out of their counter reports. So we're using, I forget, I'm on the board, I should know, JR4, that shows controlled access usage. So we took that out of here, and you can see, on average, across all of these publishers combined and all of these institutions, the cost per controlled use ranges anywhere from $8 down to $5. And it does fluctuate a little bit over time. Some publishers, it's rising over time, meaning that their costs are staying high and their usage may be declining or not increasing as fast as it used to. And don't try to read this one. It's a mess. But I just laid out everything here so you guys can see the variance in each institution per year, per publisher. Some are paying $18 or, hypothetically would be paying $18 to read an article, all the way down into the 50-cent range, depending on which publisher it is and which institution. So wide variation. And then this one's a little bit easier to see. And we're interested, are you redistributing the cost? So especially if you have an agreement with a number of institutions and you're negotiating a transformative agreement, is each institution getting the same value over time? And these are the publishers, and like I said, we lack some data for one of the publishers, the yellow bar on the end. But overall, the average costs per controlled use fluctuates. Like I said earlier when we were looking at it by institution, this is by publisher, so around $2 to $10. And then when we take a look at sorry, take that back. I'm going to go back one. These are two different institutions. So this is one of our institutions who ranged from $2 to $10, and then another institution that ranges from $4 all the way up to $18. So again, the value of reading varies by institution, and probably makes sense because most package deals were based on historical spend, and most transformative agreements are based on package deals. So they're just taking what you would have been paying anyways and turning it into the transformative agreement. Okay, that's great because we're coming down to the last slide. So also we wanted to look at, and this isn't a full study, but we wanted to look at, can you support your authors who don't often get grant funding? So this is, for the blue bar is the open access articles that were published at these institutions, and the orange bar is the ones that had no grant funding attached to them, at least that we could identify. So you can see they're not being supported super well. Most of their authors do not get grant funding. So maybe a transformative agreement is going to benefit those institutions once they have it. Again, take-home points. This is a lot of data and a lot of analysis. It's sort of hard to do individually. Broad comparisons are tough. You can look at general trends. Delta thinks data that's awesome, but you might not be able to apply it to your individual institution. And then before and after, obviously, is extremely important. So you have a transformative agreement. You've got to track it over time, over the course of time. And then on the values framework, I think we can measure transformative agreements on at least 3 of those value measures that are quantitative for now. So with that, my voice is going, but we'll take questions.
Hi, I'm Athena Hebner at the University of Central Florida, and I really applaud how much work you guys put into gathering this data, and what a great presentation it has been. And we all are very interested in trying to assess these transformative agreements. But my question, I guess, is for the vendors and publishers in the audience, why are we having to do this type of data gathering from dimensions and so forth? Are you willing to share the information that you surely have, fingers crossed, about the APC spends per our institution and related information, the usage on those articles and so forth? Is it difficult to actually prepare that information and share it with the institutions, and what are the barriers? Sorry, I know that's not a question for you guys. Maybe that's a comment for later.
Well, you want to just talk about publisher dashboard?
Yeah. Keandra, we have, for the next question, wave your hand in the air so she can see you. The lights are bright. Thank you.
So I'll take a stab at starting to answer that while we get the mic back there. You know, we've talked to publishers about getting some data, and some publishers do have some of that data, not all of it necessarily. One of the things that's really challenging is nobody knows who's paying the APCs, right? So that's sort of on the institution, but there definitely are publishers definitely can help with this and should. We were trying to do this, excuse me, in a way where we could look at a bunch of different institutions and a bunch of different publishers, right? So part of it is just our method.
Yeah,
But-
yeah, and they typically do distribute this information, especially if you've got a transformative agreement, but they're not necessarily, like, you might not have a deal, your institution might not have a deal with an individual publisher, so how do you know which one to contact? You know, like, it's kind of like opportunistic, you know, if a publisher says, hey, we're going to do a read and publish deal, then you sign up. But really, was that the most important publisher for you to sign a deal with? And what's challenging is then doing this at scale. So, you know, publisher A has a dashboard and they send you the data, publisher B sends you an Excel spreadsheet, publisher C does this, and by the time you get to 6 agreements, you're like, I can't manage any of this anymore, you know? So we do need something that does it better, you know, at a broader scale.
Yep, please go ahead.
Rob Thiessen, University of Calgary. I was just curious, since both JR1 and JR4 exclude gold OA in the counts, what's the advantage of using JR4?
Let me consult. I can't remember.
I don't remember what.
Yeah.
I can't remember what JR4 is. Will you remind us which? I need a reminder on what they are. I mean, we were using one for year-over-year publication data, right?
Yeah, I think JR3 is the year of use of publication, which I would like to get to because you've already paid for 2009, way back in 2009, so that shouldn't count for your usage, personally, I think, as a librarian. I would like to see what usage they made in 2019 of 2019 content, and then compare that to what you paid in 2019. I think JR1 is the full title report.
Right. Yep.
So,
JR1, JR3, and JR4 are all counted for
Right,
reports.
right.
And
Right.
now it's different.
Right, and we are using counter 5. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is counter 5, and it's called, it's like not, it's J underscore 4, right? Yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah.
yeah, and that's actually why we lacked data for one of the publishers, because some publishers crosswalked their old reports to release 5, and one of our publishers had not, so we can't rely on their older reports.
So John may have just outed that publisher if you spend enough time in your counter reports.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know we're a few minutes over. I hope everyone saw that the plenary schedule for later today has actually not going to happen. So you get an hour to prepare to go out to the Yorktown. But I know both John and Michael have said that they can hang around a little bit to answer questions. But before we kind of move into that phase, I just want to thank them again for the work that they put into this. And I want to thank Keandra for taking such good care of us.